I'm Sarah Chen, and last Thanksgiving, my family told me I was dead to them, so I decided to make it official. What happened next will shock you, but first, let me tell you how a family dinner turned into the moment that changed everything forever. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Growing up as the middle child in the Chen household felt like living in a constant state of invisible competition where the rules changed depending on who was playing. My older sister Jessica was the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, while my younger brother Michael was the baby who got away with everything. And me? I was the forgotten middle, the one expected to keep everyone happy while my own needs came last. Our family looked perfect from the outside. Dad ran a successful accounting firm that served half the businesses in our mid-sized Oregon town. Mom worked part-time as a real estate agent and spent the rest of her time volunteering for every charity committee that would boost our family's social standing. We lived in the nicest neighborhood, drove the right cars, and attended the Methodist, church where my parents sat on 3 different boards. But inside our picture-perfect colonial house, a different reality played out daily. Jessica, 3 years older than me, sailed through life with an ease that seemed almost supernatural. She was valedictorian, prom queen, and full scholarship recipient to Stanford. Every achievement came effortlessly, and my parents celebrated, each one like it was a miracle, even though we all knew another success was inevitable. Michael, 4 years younger, operated under completely different rules. When he brought home C's and D's, my parents hired expensive tutors and blamed the teachers for not understanding his learning style. When he got suspended for fighting, they took the school board to task for their zero-tolerance policies. When he wrecked Dad's car at 16, they bought him a newer model because clearly the old one had faulty brakes. And then there was me, Sarah, the reliable one. The one who maintained a 3.8 GPA without fanfare, who worked summers at the local veterinary clinic to save for college, who helped Mom with dinner every night and never missed curfew. My achievements were expected, my failures scrutinized, and my presence treated as a given rather than a gift. I discovered my love for animals when I was 8 years old and found an injured sparrow in our backyard. While Jessica was at ballet practice and Michael was having another meltdown about homework, I carefully nursed that little bird back to health in a shoebox lined with soft towels. Watching it fly away 2 weeks later sparked something inside me that I knew would define my future. Throughout middle school and high school, I volunteered at the animal shelter every weekend. I read every book about veterinary medicine our small-town library could get through interlibrary loans. I shadowed Dr. Martinez at the local clinic, learning everything from basic care to complex surgical procedures. My bedroom walls were covered with charts of animal anatomy rather than boy band posters. When I announced my intention to become a veterinarian, my parents' reaction was lukewarm at best. "That's nice, dear," Mom would say, "but maybe you should consider something more stable, like nursing or teaching." Dad worried about the cost of veterinary school and questioned whether I had the constitution for euthanizing animals. Neither seemed to grasp that this wasn't a whim or a phase, but a calling that consumed my thoughts and shaped my dreams. Jessica's acceptance to Stanford generated a full week of celebration. My parents threw a party, invited the neighbors, and ordered a custom cake with the Stanford logo. When my acceptance letter arrived from Oregon State's pre-veterinary program, along with a partial scholarship, the response was a quick congratulations before the conversation shifted to Michael's upcoming baseball season. The pattern continued throughout my college years. I maintained my scholarships, worked 2 part-time jobs, and spent every summer gaining hands-on experience at different veterinary practices across the state. I graduated summa cum laude with a degree in animal science and immediately enrolled in veterinary school at Washington State University. Meanwhile, Jessica was completing her MBA at Stanford and had already lined up a position at a prestigious consulting firm in San Francisco. My parents couldn't stop talking about her signing bonus and the luxury apartment her company would help. her secure. Michael had flunked out of his first college, but they'd already found him a spot at a smaller school where the football coach was willing to overlook his academic struggles in exchange for his athletic potential. Veterinary school was the most challenging thing I'd ever attempted. The coursework was intense, the clinical rotations exhausting, and the emotional toll of dealing with sick and dying animals heavier than I'd anticipated. But it was also where I found my tribe, classmates who shared my passion and understood the unique pressures of our chosen profession. During my third year, I met David Thompson, a fellow veterinary student who specialized in large animal medicine while I focused on small animal practice. He was kind, intelligent, and shared my dream of opening a practice that would serve both urban pet owners and rural farmers. We started studying together, then dating, and by our final year, we were talking about a future that included both marriage and a joint veterinary practice. I brought David home for Christmas during our final year of school, excited to share this important relationship with my family. The visit was a disaster from the moment we walked through the door. My parents were polite but distant, clearly unimpressed with David's rural Montana background and his father's occupation as a ranch foreman. During dinner, Dad questioned David extensively about his financial prospects and seemed dismayed to learn that rural veterinarians don't typically become wealthy. Mom was even worse, making subtle digs about David's clothing, his truck, and his plans to return to small-town practice rather than pursuing a more prestigious position with an urban animal hospital or research facility. By the time we left, I could see the hurt in David's eyes, though he was too polite to say anything directly. The criticism came later, of course. Mom called a week after our visit to express her concerns about David's suitability. "He seems very nice," she said in that tone that meant the opposite. "But are you sure he's ambitious enough for you? You've worked so hard to get where you are. Wouldn't you be better suited to someone who shares your drive for success?" The irony was breathtaking. Here was someone who shared my exact career goals, who understood the demands of veterinary medicine, who wanted to build something meaningful together, and my mother was questioning his ambition because he didn't want to climb some traditional corporate ladder that didn't even exist in our field. I graduated from veterinary school with honors and immediately took a position at a well-respected animal hospital in Portland, while David returned to Montana to work with his mentor, an elderly veterinarian who was looking to retire within a few years. The plan was for me to gain urban experience while David learned the ins and outs of running a rural practice, then combine our skills to open our own clinic. My parents attended my graduation, of course, but the day felt overshadowed by their obvious disappointment that I wasn't pursuing what they considered a more prestigious path. When Jessica's consulting firm flew the whole family to San Francisco for her promotion celebration 2 months later, the contrast in enthusiasm was painfully obvious. Working at the Portland Animal Hospital taught me invaluable lessons about business management, client relations, and advanced medical procedures. I was making good money, building professional relationships, and gaining the experience I needed for my future practice. More importantly, I was saving every penny possible, living in a tiny studio apartment and driving a used Honda that I'd bought with cash. My relationship with David flourished despite the distance. We talked every night, visited each other monthly, and continued planning our shared future. He was learning practice management from Dr. Harrison, the elderly veterinarian who had become his mentor, while I was mastering the latest techniques in small animal surgery and emergency medicine. 2 years into my Portland position, David called with exciting news. Dr. Harrison was ready to retire and wanted to sell his practice to David. The price was reasonable, the location was perfect, and the existing client base was both loyal and stable. There was just one catch. He needed to make the decision quickly, as another veterinarian was also interested. This was the opportunity we'd been working toward, the chance to start our practice years ahead of schedule. I had enough savings to help with the down payment, and together we could make the loan payments while building something truly our own. I gave my notice at the Portland hospital and prepared to move to Montana to start the next chapter of my life. My parents' reaction to this news was swift and brutal. Dad called it the stupidest financial decision I could possibly make, throwing away a stable position to gamble on some backwoods practice that would never generate significant income. Mom was horrified that I was moving to rural Montana, a place she'd never visited but had already decided was beneath my education and potential. The fact that this move represented the fulfillment of a carefully planned career strategy seemed irrelevant to them. They couldn't see past their own narrow definition of success to recognize that owning my own practice, serving a community that desperately needed veterinary services, and building something meaningful with the person I loved was exactly what success looked like for me. When I tried to explain the business plan David and I had developed, Dad interrupted to lecture me about the realities of small-town economics. When I mentioned how much I was looking forward to the variety of cases I'd see in a mixed practice, Mom suggested I was settling for something less than I deserved. Neither seemed interested in understanding why this opportunity excited me so much. The criticism intensified when I announced my engagement to David 6 months later. He'd proposed during a weekend visit to Portland, presenting me with his grandmother's ring and a carefully planned speech about building our life and practice together. I was over the moon, but my parents' response was decidedly cool. Jessica's engagement to her consulting firm colleague had generated months of excitement, dress shopping expeditions, and elaborate wedding planning discussions. My engagement warranted a brief congratulations followed immediately by concerns about whether I was rushing into marriage and whether David was truly the right person for someone with my education and potential. The wedding planning process became a minefield of passive-aggressive comments and subtle sabotage. Every decision I made was quietly criticized or suggested to be improved. The venue was too rustic, the flowers too simple, the guest list too small. When I mentioned wanting to keep costs reasonable since we were saving money for the practice, Mom sighed dramatically and said she'd always hoped to give her daughters the weddings they deserved. Jessica's wedding 3 years earlier had been a lavish affair at the country club, with 200 guests, an 8-piece band, and a reception that lasted until midnight. My wedding was going to be a more intimate celebration at David's family ranch, with barbecue catered by the local restaurant and dancing to a playlist we'd carefully curated ourselves. The contrast wasn't lost on anyone, least of all my parents, who seemed personally offended that I wasn't interested in the kind of social display that would reflect well on their status in the community. They couldn't understand that the ranch wedding perfectly represented who David and I were as a couple, just as the country club celebration had suited Jessica and her husband. 3 months before the wedding, I made my final attempt to bridge the growing gap between my vision for my life and my parents' expectations. I invited them to visit Montana, to see the practice David and I were building, to meet his family and understand the community we'd be serving. I wanted them to witness firsthand why this move excited me so much. The visit was a catastrophe from start to finish. My parents arrived with obvious reluctance, making disparaging comments about the small airport, the rural landscape, and the modest town where our practice was located. They met David's parents with barely concealed condescension, clearly viewing them as beneath our family's social status despite their warmth and genuine hospitality. When I showed them around the veterinary clinic, pointing out the improvements we were making and explaining our plans for expansion, Dad focused only on the financial limitations, and Mom worried aloud about me wasting my education in such a small community. They couldn't see the state-of-the-art equipment we were installing, the grateful clients who brought us homemade pies, or the satisfaction evident in David's face as he showed them around his domain. The final straw came during dinner at David's family ranch. His mother had spent days preparing a feast featuring beef from their own cattle, vegetables from their garden, and pies made from berries the family had picked themselves. It was a celebration of their heritage and a gesture of welcome to my parents that represented hours of loving preparation. My parents spent the entire meal making subtle complaints about the food, the rustic dining room, and the casual family atmosphere. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. They name-dropped restaurants in Portland and San Francisco, discussed their recent cruise to Alaska, and generally behaved like anthropologists studying a primitive culture rather than guests being honored with genuine hospitality. I was mortified by their behavior and heartbroken by their inability to see the beauty in this simpler way of life. These people were welcoming them with open arms, sharing their best with grace and generosity, and my parents were responding with barely concealed disdain. The drive back to the airport was conducted in tense silence until Mom finally spoke. "I hope you know what you're doing, Sarah," she said, staring out the window at the passing countryside. "This is such a different life from what we imagined for you." Dad nodded grimly and added, "We've given you the best education money can buy. It seems like a waste to throw it away on this." Their words stung because I recognized the fundamental disconnect they represented. They couldn't see that I was using my education exactly as intended, that serving this community was meaningful work, that building something with David was an achievement to be celebrated rather than a compromise to be mourned. I got married on a perfect October day, surrounded by people who truly celebrated our union. David's family embraced me completely, treating me like the daughter they'd always wanted. My parents attended, dressed appropriately and behaving correctly, but their emotional absence was palpable. They participated in the ceremony like actors playing roles rather than parents celebrating their daughter's happiness. The photographs from that day tell the story clearly. David's family is laughing, crying happy tears, and radiating genuine joy. My parents look like they're attending a business function, smiling politely but without warmth. The contrast was so obvious that several guests asked if everything was okay between my family and me. After the wedding, David and I threw ourselves into building our practice. We worked 18-hour days, taking turns with emergency calls, and slowly expanding our client base. The work was challenging, but incredibly rewarding. We delivered calves in the middle of winter nights, performed life-saving surgeries on beloved pets, and became integral parts of our community. Our first year was financially tight, but emotionally rich. We rented a small farmhouse 10 minutes from the clinic, adopting every stray animal that wandered into our lives. By our second anniversary, we had 3 dogs, 2 cats, a rescue horse, and a flock of chickens that had started as patients and somehow never left. The practice flourished as word spread about our dedication and skill. We hired our first assistant, then a second, and eventually a part-time receptionist. Dr. Harrison stayed on as a consultant, teaching us the business side of veterinary medicine and introducing us to suppliers and specialists throughout the region. My relationship with my parents remained strained but functional. We exchanged holiday cards, made obligatory phone calls on birthdays, and maintained the facade of family connection without any real intimacy. They visited exactly once in our first 3 years of marriage, staying for an uncomfortable weekend during which they managed to find fault with everything from our home to our lifestyle choices. Jessica's life continued on its predictable trajectory of conventional success. She was promoted again, bought a house in an exclusive San Francisco neighborhood, and started talking about having children with the same strategic planning she applied to her career advancement. My parents spoke of her achievements with obvious pride and compared them frequently to my more modest rural life. Michael's path remained chaotic despite their continued financial and emotional support. He'd transferred schools twice, changed majors 4 times, and was currently pursuing a communications degree that seemed designed more to keep him in college than to prepare him for any specific career. Every semester brought new crises that my parents solved with checkbooks and phone calls to administrators. The disparity in treatment had become so normalized that I barely noticed it anymore. I'd built a life that satisfied me deeply, surrounded myself with people who valued my contributions, and found my worth in the work I did rather than my parents' approval. Their opinions stung less when I had a community that appreciated me for exactly who I was. Everything changed during my 4th year of practice when I was diagnosed with endometriosis. The condition had been causing increasingly severe pain during my menstrual cycles. Pain I'd been ignoring because I was too busy with the practice to address my own health needs. When I finally saw a specialist, the diagnosis came with the devastating news that my fertility was severely compromised. David and I had been talking about starting a family, planning to begin trying for children once the practice was more established. The diagnosis forced us to confront the possibility that biological children might not be in our future, at least not without significant medical intervention that offered no guarantees. The emotional impact was overwhelming. I'd always assumed I'd be a mother someday, had pictured raising children on our little farm, teaching them about animals and nature and the satisfaction of building something meaningful with your hands. The thought that this dream might be impossible left me grief-stricken in ways I hadn't anticipated. David was incredible during this crisis, holding me through the worst moments and researching every possible treatment option. We consulted specialists in 3 different states, explored fertility treatments, and investigated adoption possibilities. The process was emotionally and financially draining, but it brought us closer together as we navigated this unexpected challenge. My parents' response to the diagnosis was typically disappointing. Mom offered awkward sympathy mixed with suggestions that maybe this was for the best given our rural location and limited resources. Dad was even more insensitive, pointing out that children would be expensive and might interfere with the practice we'd worked so hard to build. Neither seemed to grasp the depth of our grief or the significance of this loss to our vision of our future. Their practical, emotionally distant response felt like another confirmation that we inhabited completely different universes when it came to what mattered in life. Meanwhile, Jessica announced her pregnancy with her first child, news that generated weeks of celebration and preparation from my parents. They flew to San Francisco multiple times to help set up the nursery, research private schools, and interview potential nannies. The contrast between their reaction to her pregnancy and their dismissal of my infertility struggles was painful but not surprising. I threw myself into work during this difficult period, finding solace in the daily routine of caring for animals and serving our community. Our practice continued to grow, and we were considering purchasing the building we'd been renting when Dr. Harrison decided to sell his property. The expansion would allow us to add boarding facilities and maybe even bring in another veterinarian to help with the increasing caseload. It was during this period of professional growth and personal struggle that I received the phone call that would change everything. Jessica was calling to announce that she and her husband had decided to host Thanksgiving at their San Francisco home for the first time, and she wanted the whole family to come celebrate. The invitation felt significant because it suggested a level of family unity that had been missing for years. Maybe this was an opportunity to reconnect, to share our struggles and successes with people who should care about our well-being. I was cautiously optimistic as David and I made plans to travel to California for what I hoped would be a healing family gathering. I should have known better. The signs were all there, patterns established over decades of family interactions. But some small part of me still hoped that time and distance might have softened their judgment, that seeing our success might finally earn their respect, that family loyalty might overcome their disappointment in my unconventional choices. The trip to San Francisco required careful coordination with our practice coverage, as we rarely left town simultaneously. Dr. Harrison agreed to handle emergencies, and our staff promised to manage routine appointments. We boarded our animals with friends and prepared for what we hoped would be a positive family reunion. I packed carefully, choosing clothes that would meet my mother's standards while still feeling authentic to who I'd become. I brought photographs of the practice, updates on our community involvement, and stories about the meaningful work we were doing. I was ready to build bridges, to find common ground, to finally help them understand why I'd chosen this path. The flight to San Francisco gave me time to reflect on how much had changed since my last visit to Jessica's home. David and I had established ourselves professionally, weathered personal challenges together, and built a life of genuine meaning and satisfaction. I felt more confident in my choices than ever before, more certain that we'd created something valuable despite my parents' reservations. As our plane descended toward the Bay Area, I looked out at the sprawling urban landscape and felt a familiar pang of gratitude for our rural Montana home. This city represented everything my parents valued: success, sophistication, financial achievement, but it felt alien to me now. I was visiting a foreign country, even though this was where I'd grown up. Jessica met us at the airport with hugs that felt genuine but brief. She looked polished and successful in her designer clothes and luxury SUV, every inch the urban professional my parents had hoped I'd become. Her conversation focused on traffic patterns and restaurant reservations, the logistics of city living. That had once seemed normal, but now felt unnecessarily complicated. Her house was stunning, a showcase of contemporary design and expensive furnishings that belonged in a magazine spread. Every detail was perfect, from the fresh flowers arranged by a professional service to the wine collection that required its own climate-controlled room. It was beautiful and impressive and utterly soulless, at least to my eyes. Mom and Dad had arrived the day before and had already settled into the guest suite with its own sitting area and marble bathroom. They greeted us warmly enough, asking about our flight and commenting on how well we both looked. The conversation felt careful, polite, like we were all walking around something fragile that might shatter if handled roughly. Michael arrived that evening with his latest girlfriend, a philosophy major named Brittany, who spoke exclusively in abstractions and seemed to view our rural lifestyle as a fascinating example of Americans disconnecting from meaningful culture. Her condescension was subtle but persistent, framing our choices as interesting but ultimately limiting. The first day passed pleasantly enough. We toured Jessica's neighborhood, visited local museums, and dined at restaurants that confirmed my parents' sophisticated tastes. I shared updates about our practice and community, keeping the conversation light and focusing on our successes rather than our struggles. But beneath the surface politeness, I could sense familiar currents of judgment and disapproval. Comments about the quaintness of small-town life, suggestions that I must miss urban amenities, questions about whether I ever regretted my career choices. Nothing overtly critical, but a steady undercurrent of assumption that my life represented a compromise rather than a choice. The breaking point came on Thanksgiving Day itself, during what should have been a celebration of family and gratitude. The conversation that would destroy our relationship forever started innocuously enough, but escalated with a speed and viciousness that left me reeling. And that conversation would change everything, setting in motion events that would force me to choose between family loyalty and self-respect, between maintaining peace and defending my truth. What my family said to me that day, and what I decided to do about it, would define the rest of my life. Thanksgiving morning dawned crisp and clear in San Francisco, the kind of perfect California day that made everything seem possible. I woke up in Jessica's immaculate guest room feeling cautiously optimistic about the day ahead. David was already up, checking on a few of our patients via phone with Dr. Harrison, his quiet voice a comforting reminder of the life we'd built together back home. Jessica had planned an elaborate Thanksgiving feast, complete with a 20-pound heritage turkey from some exclusive farm in Sonoma County, and side dishes that required ingredients I'd never heard of. She'd hired a catering company to handle the preparation, which seemed excessive for a family dinner but was apparently standard for her social circle. I offered to help with the cooking, hoping to find some way to contribute to the meal and maybe connect with my sister on a more personal level. She politely declined, explaining that everything was already coordinated and my assistance would only confuse the professional staff she'd hired. Even her rejection felt polished and distant, delivered with the same smile she probably used with difficult clients at her consulting firm. Mom spent the morning arranging flowers and adjusting place settings with the precision of someone orchestrating a photo shoot rather than a family gathering. Every detail had to be perfect, From the crystal stemware that caught the morning light, just so to the cloth napkins folded into elaborate shapes that seemed more decorative than functional. Dad positioned himself in the living room with his newspaper and coffee, holding court from his leather chair while making periodic pronouncements about politics, business trends, and the general decline of American work ethic. His commentary felt performative, designed to demonstrate his sophistication and insider knowledge rather than invite genuine conversation. Michael arrived late, as usual, with Brittany in tow and a hangover that he tried unsuccessfully to hide behind designer sunglasses and excessive cologne. They'd apparently spent the previous evening at some underground poetry reading in the Mission District, an experience Brittany described in excruciating detail while we waited for the meal service. To begin, the dining room had been transformed into something resembling a magazine spread, complete with autumn centerpieces and place cards written in calligraphy. Jessica had assigned seating with the careful calculation of a diplomatic summit, positioning family members to minimize conflict while maximizing the impression of harmonious togetherness. I found myself seated between Dad and Brittany, a placement that felt strategic rather than coincidental. David was positioned across from me, but separated by an elaborate floral arrangement that made eye contact difficult. The physical distance felt symbolic of the emotional barriers that had existed between my family and me for years. The meal began pleasantly enough, with everyone commenting appropriately on the food quality and Jessica accepting compliments on her hosting skills. With gracious modesty, the conversation flowed through safe topics like travel plans, local restaurants, and updates on family friends I barely remembered from high school. Mom dominated much of the discussion with detailed accounts of their recent European river cruise, describing each city they'd visited with the enthusiasm of someone recounting a spiritual pilgrimage. Dad chimed in periodically with observations about European business practices and currency exchange rates, turning even vacation memories into opportunities to display his financial expertise. Jessica shared updates about her work projects, speaking in corporate jargon that made her sound more like a business textbook than my sister. Her promotion had apparently come with significant new responsibilities and a corner office that she described with barely contained pride. Every detail reinforced the narrative of her continued upward trajectory in the world my parents valued most. Michael's updates were more scattered, jumping between his current classes, potential internship opportunities, and vague plans for post-graduation employment that seemed to change weekly. Brittany interjected frequently with philosophical observations about the meaninglessness of traditional career paths and the importance of pursuing authentic self-expression over financial stability. When the conversation turned to me, I shared positive news about our practice expansion, the new boarding facilities we were planning, and some of the more interesting cases we'd handled recently. I tried to make our work sound engaging and successful, hoping to finally earn some recognition for what we'd accomplished. Dad listened with polite attention, but I could see his mental calculations working, probably estimating our annual income and comparing it unfavorably to Jessica's corporate salary. Mom smiled and nodded, but her questions focused more on whether I missed city amenities than on celebrating our professional achievements. The first hint of trouble came when Jessica mentioned that Caroline Westfield, a mutual friend from high school, had recently completed her residency in plastic surgery and was joining an exclusive practice in Beverly Hills. The comparison was subtle but unmistakable. Another example of someone from our social circle achieving the kind of prestigious success my parents valued. Mom picked up the thread immediately, reminiscing about Caroline's achievements in high school and college, her medical school honors, and the impressive salary she'd undoubtedly command in her new position. The subtext was clear without being stated directly. Caroline had made choices that led to obvious success, while I had chosen a path that seemed lesser by comparison. I tried to redirect the conversation by mentioning Dr. Martinez, my old mentor from the clinic where I'd first volunteered, who had recently been honored by the State Veterinary Association for his lifetime of service to underserved communities. But my attempt to highlight meaningful work over financial achievement fell flat. generating polite acknowledgement, but no real engagement. The tension began building when Dad asked David about his family's ranch operation, framing his questions in ways that highlighted the financial limitations of agricultural work. How many head of cattle did they run? What kind of profit margins could small ranchers expect in the current market? Had they considered selling the land for development? Given rising property values, David answered graciously, explaining the ranch's history, the family's commitment to sustainable practices, and their role in the local agricultural community. But I could see Dad's skepticism growing with each response, his business-minded assessment finding David's family lacking in the kind of ambition and financial acumen he respected. Brittany contributed her own form of condescension, praising David's family for maintaining connection to the land and traditional ways of life that urban Americans had lost. Her romanticized view of rural living was almost as insulting as Dad's financial dismissal, reducing David's heritage to some kind of anthropological curiosity rather than a legitimate way of life. The conversation took a darker turn when Mom began discussing Jessica's recent house hunting expedition, her search for a larger property in an even more exclusive neighborhood that would better reflect her rising status. The casual mention of seven-figure price ranges and the importance of school district rankings felt like a pointed comparison to our modest farmhouse and rural community. Jessica joined in enthusiastically, describing the marble countertops, wine cellars, and landscaping, services that were apparently standard in the neighborhoods she was considering. Her excitement was genuine, but it also felt performative, designed to showcase a lifestyle that was obviously superior to anything David and I could afford. I found myself growing increasingly uncomfortable as the conversation continued to revolve around material achievements and social status. Every topic seemed chosen to highlight the gap between their urban success and our rural contentment, between their financial accomplishments and our commitment to service and community. The breaking point began when Michael, clearly feeling left out of the success narratives dominating the conversation, made an offhand comment about at least being smart enough not to bury himself in some backwoods town where nobody would ever hear from him again. The comment was directed at me, thinly veiled as a joke, but carrying an unmistakable edge of resentment and superiority. Before I could respond, Dad laughed and agreed that geographic isolation was one of the biggest career mistakes young professionals could make in today's interconnected economy. The casual dismissal of my entire life's work felt like a slap, delivered with the authority of someone who'd never bothered to understand what I actually did or why it mattered. Mom chimed in with her own observations about the limitations of small-town life, particularly for someone with my education and potential. She spoke as if my move to Montana had been a temporary adventure that I should have outgrown by now, a phase that had gone on far too long and needed gentle correction from people who knew better. I felt my face flushing as the conversation continued around me, each family member contributing their own version of concern about my choices. Their words were couched in loving language, but the underlying message was clear: I had wasted my potential, disappointed their expectations, and chosen a life that was fundamentally inferior to what they'd envisioned for me. David reached across the table to touch my hand, a gesture of support that I desperately needed, but that also drew unwanted attention to my emotional state. Jessica noticed the exchange and asked if everything was all right, her tone carrying just enough concern to seem caring while actually highlighting my distress for everyone to observe. I tried to deflect by explaining how fulfilling our work had been, how much our community meant to us, and how proud I was of what we'd built together. But my words sounded defensive even to my own ears, and I could see the family exchanging those subtle glances that confirmed their shared assessment of my poor life choices. The conversation spiraled from there, with each family member feeling increasingly free to express their honest opinions about my career, my marriage, my geographic location, and my apparent inability to recognize my own mistakes. Their criticism was delivered with the casual cruelty of people who believed they were helping me see reason, saving me from continued delusion about my circumstances. Dad launched into a detailed analysis of rural economic trends, explaining why small-town businesses were unsustainable in the modern economy and how my veterinary practice was probably operating on borrowed time. His certainty was absolute, backed by decades of business experience that apparently qualified him to judge industries he'd never worked in and communities he'd never lived in. Mom focused on social and cultural limitations, wondering aloud how someone with my education could tolerate the intellectual isolation of rural life. She painted a picture of my daily existence that bore no resemblance to reality, describing a wasteland of ignorance and narrow-mindedness that only someone with limited options would choose to endure. Jessica contributed her own professional perspective, suggesting that I was essentially hiding from real career challenges by choosing a practice environment that was too small to offer meaningful advancement opportunities. Her analysis reduced my life's work to career avoidance, a way of avoiding the competitive pressures that successful professionals learn to navigate. Even Michael, whose own academic and professional record was hardly exemplary, felt qualified to offer opinions about my choices. He suggested that I was probably afraid of failing in a more demanding environment, that rural practice was the easy path for someone who couldn't handle big city pressures. Brittany provided the pseudo-intellectual framework for their criticism, explaining how rural life represented a retreat from authentic engagement with contemporary culture and social progress. Her words made my community sound like some kind of backward museum piece, populated by people too ignorant or frightened to participate in modern society. Throughout this assault, David remained remarkably composed, occasionally attempting to redirect the conversation or offer alternative perspectives on rural life and veterinary practice, but his efforts were largely ignored or dismissed as the defensive responses of someone who'd obviously never experienced better options. I sat there listening to my family systematically dismantle everything I'd worked for, everything I valued, everything that gave my life meaning and purpose. Their words came from a place of casual certainty, the absolute conviction of people who'd never questioned their own assumptions about success, happiness, and the proper way to live a meaningful life. The most painful part wasn't the criticism itself, though that was certainly hurtful enough. It was the realization that this conversation revealed how they'd always seen me, how they'd probably talked about me when I wasn't present, how little respect they had for the choices that had brought me the deepest satisfaction I'd ever known. They weren't just questioning my decisions, they were questioning my intelligence, my character, my ability to recognize my own best interests. They were speaking to me like a child who'd gotten confused about reality and needed patient correction from wiser adults who could see what I obviously couldn't. As the conversation continued, I found myself thinking about the clients who trusted me with their beloved animals, the farmers who called me in the middle of the night when their livestock needed emergency care, the community members who'd welcomed David and me with genuine warmth and acceptance. The contrast between that authentic support and my family's conditional approval couldn't have been more stark. I thought about Dr. Harrison, who'd spent 40 years serving rural communities and had trained dozens of young veterinarians who carried on his legacy of dedicated service. I thought about the colleagues I'd met at professional conferences, brilliant and committed veterinarians who'd chosen rural practice specifically because of the challenges and opportunities it offered. I thought about the animals I'd saved, the relationships I'd built, the difference I'd made in people's lives during their most vulnerable moments. None of that seemed to matter to my family, who could only measure success through financial achievement and social status, who couldn't conceive of meaningful work that didn't come with prestige and recognition. The attack continued relentlessly, each family member building on the other's criticisms to create a comprehensive indictment of my life choices. They spoke with the casual cruelty of people who believed they were doing me a favor, opening my eyes to realities I'd been too stubborn or naive to acknowledge on my own. Dad suggested that it wasn't too late to change course, to pursue opportunities in more promising locations with larger veterinary practices or research institutions. His tone implied that recognizing my mistakes would be the first step toward redemption, toward finally living up to the potential they'd always seen in me. Mom agreed enthusiastically, mentioning several family friends whose children had made similar career transitions, leaving smaller practices for positions that offered better advancement opportunities and more sophisticated social environments. Her examples were clearly meant to provide roadmaps for my own eventual return to their version of success. Jessica offered to help with networking opportunities in San Francisco, suggesting that her professional connections might open doors I couldn't access from Montana. Her generosity felt condescending, the gesture of someone reaching down to help, a family member who'd gotten lost but could still be rescued with proper guidance. Even Michael, emboldened by the family consensus about my poor choices, suggested that admitting mistakes was a sign of maturity, that successful people knew when to cut their losses and pursue better opportunities. His advice would have been laughable if it wasn't so perfectly representative of the family's complete misunderstanding of my actual situation. The breaking point came when Mom made an observation about my biological clock, wondering aloud whether living in such an isolated location was affecting my fertility issues. Her words implied that my medical condition was somehow connected to my geographic choices, that returning to civilization might solve problems that rural life had created or exacerbated. The suggestion was medically ridiculous and personally devastating, reducing my deepest struggle to another consequence of my supposedly poor life choices. But it also revealed how thoroughly my family had constructed a narrative in which everything negative in my life could be traced back to my decision to leave their prescribed path. I felt something snap inside me at that moment, a final thread of patience or hope or family loyalty that had been holding me to these people despite years of disappointment and disapproval. The realization that they would weaponize even my infertility. Struggles to support their arguments about my life choices crossed a line I hadn't known existed. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady but cold, carrying a calmness that surprised even me. I looked around the table at these people who shared my DNA, but understood nothing about my heart, my values, or my dreams. The words that came out of my mouth would change everything, severing connections that had already been strained beyond recognition. What I said next would force them to reveal their true feelings about me, about my worth as a family member, about whether their love came with conditions I could never meet. Their response would confirm what I'd suspected for years but had been too hopeful to accept, that their approval required me to become someone I could never be. The conversation that followed would strip away any remaining illusions about our relationship, forcing all of us to confront the reality that love and respect are not the same thing, that family ties cannot survive fundamental differences in values and priorities, that sometimes the kindest thing people can do is admit they're incompatible. What my family said to me in response to my words would echo in my mind for months afterward, not because of their cruelty, but because of their honesty. For the first time, they would drop their polite pretenses and tell me exactly how they'd always seen me, exactly what they thought of my choices, exactly what place I held in their version of the family story. Their words would hurt, but they would also liberate me from the exhausting effort of trying to earn approval from people who'd never understood me, never valued what I valued, never seen me as anything more than a disappointment to be managed or corrected or ultimately discarded. The explosion that followed my response would destroy our family permanently, but it would also free me to build something better, something based on mutual respect and authentic connection rather than obligation and conditional acceptance. Sometimes, destruction is the only path to genuine creation. Sometimes endings are the only way to find real beginnings. The Thanksgiving dinner that was supposed to celebrate family togetherness would instead become the moment when I learned the difference between being related to people and actually belonging with them, between sharing DNA and sharing values, between being someone's daughter and being someone's family. What happened next would change my understanding of loyalty, love, and the courage required to choose authenticity over acceptance, to choose peace over pretense, to choose the family that chooses you back over the family that never really wanted you in the first place. The words that would end our relationship forever were building in my throat, powered by years of accumulated hurt and disappointment. When I finally spoke them, There would be no taking them back, no pretending the conversation had never happened, no returning to the comfortable fiction that we were a loving family with minor disagreements about life priorities. I was about to burn bridges I'd spent 30 years trying to cross, but I was also about to discover that some bridges lead nowhere worth going, that some connections cause more pain than their absence ever could, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do for people is to stop trying to force them to love you back. The silence that followed my words would stretch out like a held breath, pregnant with possibilities and consequences that none of us had anticipated when we sat down for what we'd imagined would be a pleasant family meal. In that silence, relationships would shift, truths would emerge, and the trajectory of my entire future would change direction. When the silence finally broke, it would shatter everything we'd pretended to be as a family, revealing the reality that had always existed beneath our polite interactions. The explosion that followed would be spectacular in its finality, devastating in its completeness, and ultimately liberating in its honesty about who we really were to each other. The last words my family would ever speak to me as their daughter would ring in my ears as I walked away from that table, away from that house, away from people who'd never understood that love without respect is not love at all. That acceptance, with conditions, is not acceptance at all. That family that requires you to be someone else is not family at all. But those words were still coming. For now, we sat in the calm before the storm, in the last moments before everything changed forever, in the final seconds when we could still pretend that this was just another difficult conversation rather than the end of everything we'd tried to build together across 3 decades of shared history. I set down my fork with deliberate precision, the small sound seeming unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet that had settled over the dining room. Every face around the table was turned toward me, waiting for my response to Mom's devastating comment about my fertility being connected to my geographic choices. The moment felt suspended in time, heavy with unspoken tensions that had been building for years. When I finally spoke, my voice carried a clarity and strength that surprised even me. You know what's interesting about this conversation? I began, looking directly at each family member in turn. You've spent the last hour systematically dismantling every choice I've made, every value I hold dear, and every achievement I'm proud of. And you've done it all while claiming to love me and want what's best for me. Dad's face immediately hardened, recognizing the shift in my tone from defensive to offensive. Sarah, there's no need to be dramatic. We're simply expressing concern about your future. No, Dad. You're expressing disappointment that I haven't become the person you wanted me to be. There's a difference. I turned to address the entire table, feeling a strange calm descend over me as I finally gave voice to thoughts I'd kept buried for years. You want to know what I think? I think you're all so invested in a narrow definition of success that you can't recognize genuine happiness when it's sitting right in front of you. Jessica shifted uncomfortably in her chair, clearly not expecting this level of directness from me. Sarah, we just want you to reach your full potential. You're so talented, and we hate to see you limiting yourself. Limiting myself? I laughed, but there was no humor in it. I run a successful veterinary practice that serves 3 counties. I'm respected in my community, trusted with people's most precious animals, and I've built something meaningful with the person I love. How exactly is that limiting myself? Because you could have done so much more, Mom interjected, her voice taking on that patient tone she used when explaining obvious truths to slow children. You could have been a research veterinarian at a university, or worked for a pharmaceutical company, or opened a practice in a major city where you'd have real opportunities for advancement. According to whose definition of more? I shot back. According to people who measure success only in salary figures and social status? According to people who think rural communities don't deserve quality veterinary care? According to people who've never bothered to understand what actually makes me happy? The room fell silent except for the soft ticking of Jessica's expensive mantel clock. David reached for my hand under the table, offering quiet support without inserting himself into the family dynamic. His presence steadied me, reminding me that at least one person in this room understood and valued who I really was. Michael broke the silence with a nervous laugh. "Come on, Sarah, don't act like we're the villains here. We're just being realistic about your situation." "My situation?" I turned my full attention to my younger brother, this man-child who'd never held a steady job or taken responsibility for his own failures. "Michael, you've changed majors more times than I can count. You're 26 years old and still financially dependent on our parents, and you have the audacity to judge my life choices?" His face flushed red, but before he could respond, Dad intervened with the authoritative voice he'd always used to shut down family conflicts. "That's enough. This conversation has gone too far." "Has it?" I stood up, my napkin falling to the floor as I faced the man who'd shaped so much of my understanding about worth and achievement. Or maybe it hasn't gone far enough. Maybe it's time we finally had an honest conversation about what you all really think of me. "We think you're throwing away your potential," Dad said bluntly, his business mask slipping to reveal genuine frustration. "We invested in your education, supported your dreams, and watched you choose the easiest possible path instead of challenging yourself to achieve something meaningful." The words hit like physical blows, but they also clarified everything I'd suspected for years. The easiest path? "Dad, do you have any idea what veterinary school was like? Do you know what it takes to build a practice from nothing? Do you understand the skill required to perform surgery on a horse in a barn at midnight? Or the emotional strength needed to help families say goodbye to beloved pets?" "That's not the kind of challenge I'm talking about," he replied dismissively. "I'm talking about real professional advancement, financial growth, building something that matters in the broader economy, something that matters to whom?" My voice was rising now, years of suppressed anger finally finding expression. "To your golf buddies? To Mom's social circle? To people who think the only valuable work happens in offices and boardrooms?" Brittany chose that moment to inject her philosophy major insights. "I think what Sarah is experiencing is a defensive response to having her lifestyle choices questioned. It's natural to feel attacked when your worldview is challenged." I turned to this stranger who'd been dating my brother for 3 months and felt qualified to analyze my psychology. "Brittany, with all due respect, you don't know me, you don't understand my work, and your armchair psychology isn't welcome in this conversation." "There's no need to be rude to our guest," Mom said sharply, always more concerned with appearances than substance. "Brittany is just trying to help provide perspective." "Perspective?" I laughed again, the sound bitter even to my own ears. "You want perspective? Here's some perspective. I've saved hundreds of animals' lives. I've comforted grieving families. I've helped farmers keep their livelihoods intact. I've contributed to my community in ways that actually matter to real people dealing with real problems. And none of that means anything to any of you because it doesn't come with a corner office or a 6-figure salary." Jessica finally found her voice, speaking in the measured tones she probably used in boardroom presentations. "Sarah, we're not dismissing your work. We're just concerned that you've settled for less than you could achieve. You're clearly passionate about veterinary medicine, but that passion could take you so much further in a different environment." "Further according to whose map?" I demanded. "Further up what ladder? Toward what goal? You keep talking about potential and achievement like there's some universal standard we're all supposed to reach. But you never ask whether your definition of success has any meaning for me. Success is success," Dad stated with the certainty of someone who'd never questioned his own assumptions. "Financial security, professional recognition, social status, these things matter whether you want to admit it or not." "They matter to you," I corrected. "They don't matter to me. What matters to me is doing work that makes a difference, building relationships based on mutual respect, and creating a life that aligns with my values rather than other people's expectations." That's very noble, Mom said with a condescension that made my teeth clench. But idealism doesn't pay bills or provide security for the future. We pay our bills just fine, David finally spoke up, his quiet voice cutting through the tension. We own our home, our practice is profitable, and we're financially stable. The assumption that rural veterinarians are struggling financially is just another stereotype that doesn't match reality. Dad turned his attention to David with obvious irritation. I wasn't addressing you, David. This is a family discussion. Actually, David is my family, I said firmly. He's my husband, my partner, and my closest ally. If anyone doesn't belong in this family discussion, it's the philosophy student who's been dating Michael for 3 months, not the man I've been married to for 4 years. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees as the implications of my words sank in. I'd just explicitly stated that David was more family to me than the people I shared blood with, and everyone understood the significance of that declaration. How dare you? Mom's voice was low and dangerous, the polite facade finally cracking to reveal genuine anger. How dare you compare some stranger to your own family, people who've loved and supported you your entire life? Loved and supported. Me? I felt something break loose inside my chest, years of accumulated hurt and disappointment spilling out in a rush. When? When have you loved and supported me? When you dismissed my straight A's as expected while celebrating Michael's C's? When you questioned every major life decision I've made? When you treated David like he wasn't good enough for your family? When you just suggested my medical condition was somehow my fault for living in the wrong place? We've always loved you, Dad insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. Everything we've done has been because we want what's best for you. No, everything you've done has been because you want me to want what you think is best. There's a huge difference. I was pacing now, unable to contain the energy of finally speaking truths I'd kept hidden for years. You've never once asked me what would make me happy. You've never tried to understand why I chose the path I did. You've just assumed I was wrong and spent years trying to correct me. Because you are wrong, Michael burst out, emboldened by alcohol and family loyalty. You're wasting your life in some tiny town where nobody important will ever know your name. You could have been somebody, Sarah, but instead, you chose to be nobody. The words hung in the air like a physical presence, so cruel and absolute that even Michael seemed surprised by what he'd said. David's hand tightened on mine, and I could feel his anger radiating through his careful composure. Nobody? I repeated softly, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. I'm nobody because I don't live in a major city? I'm nobody because I chose meaningful work over prestige? I'm nobody because I built a life that makes me happy instead of one that would impress your friends? You know what I mean, Michael backpedaled weakly, but the damage was done. Actually, I do know what you mean. You mean that the only people who matter are people like you, people who define themselves by external validation and social status. You mean that serving rural communities doesn't count as real work? That healing animals doesn't count as meaningful contribution? That building relationships based on genuine care doesn't count as success? Jessica tried to regain control of the conversation, her corporate training kicking in as she attempted damage control. Sarah, I think we're all getting a bit emotional here. Maybe we should take a break and revisit this conversation when everyone's calmed down. I am calm, I said, and realized it was true. Beneath the anger and hurt, I felt a strange peace settling over me. The peace that comes with finally seeing a situation clearly. I'm calmer than I've been in years, actually, because I'm finally understanding something I should have realized a long time ago. What's that? Dad asked warily. That you don't actually know me at all. You know the version of me that you wanted me to become, the successful city veterinarian with the impressive practice and the prominent social circle. But the real me, the person who finds joy in midnight emergency calls and small-town community, festivals, and building something meaningful with someone I love, that person is a complete stranger to you. That's not true, Mom protested, but her voice lacked conviction. Isn't it? Can you name one thing about my actual life that you genuinely admire? One choice I've made that you think was right? One aspect of the life David and I have built that you respect? I waited, watching their faces as they struggled to find an answer that wouldn't sound hollow or condescending. The silence stretched out uncomfortably, confirming what I'd already suspected. Their love for me was entirely conditional, based on a version of me that had never existed and never would exist. We admire your dedication, Jessica finally offered weakly. My dedication to what? To making the wrong choices? To wasting my potential? To disappointing you at every turn? I shook my head. No, you don't admire my dedication. You tolerate it while hoping I'll eventually come to my senses and become the person you always expected me to be. And what's wrong with having expectations? For your children? Dad demanded, his business voice returning as he tried to regain authority over the conversation. What's wrong with wanting you to succeed? Nothing's wrong with wanting your children to succeed. Everything's wrong with defining their success so narrowly that you can't recognize it when it doesn't match your blueprint. I looked around the table at these people who shared my genetics but understood nothing about my heart. I am successful, Dad. I'm successful by every measure that actually matters to me. But because my success doesn't look like what you wanted, you can't see it. Success that nobody recognizes isn't really success, Brittany chimed in with the confidence of someone who'd never tested her theories against reality. Nobody recognizes it? I turned to face her directly. My clients recognize it when I save their animals' lives. My community recognizes it when I provide care that keeps their farms running. My colleagues recognize it when they refer difficult cases to me because they trust my skills. The only people who don't recognize it are sitting at this table. Those people don't matter, Mom said dismissively, finally revealing the core of her worldview. What matters is recognition from people who understand real achievement, people in positions of influence and authority. People like you mean. The pieces were finally clicking into place, the puzzle of my family's disappointment finally making sense. People who think influence and authority come from money and social status rather than from actually helping others and contributing to your community. Money and status exist for a reason, Dad lectured, slipping into the tone he used when explaining basic economics to clients. They're markers of value creation, indicators that someone has contributed something meaningful to society. According to whose definition of meaningful? I shot back. According to people who think the only valuable contributions happen in boardrooms and corporate offices? According to people who think serving rural communities doesn't count as real work? You're being deliberately obtuse, Jessica accused, her patience finally wearing thin. We all understand that veterinary work is important. We're questioning whether you're doing it in a way that maximizes your impact and potential. My impact on whom? My potential for what? I was tired now, exhausted by the circular nature of this conversation and the fundamental disconnect it revealed. You keep using these words like they have universal definitions, but they don't. Impact and potential are only meaningful in context, and the context you're using doesn't include anything I actually care about. Then maybe the problem is what you care about, Michael said with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never examined his own values. Maybe you need to care about things that actually matter. That was the moment everything crystallized, when I finally understood that this conversation was never going to end differently, no matter how long we continued it. These people weren't criticizing my choices because they wanted to help me improve them. They were criticizing my choices because those choices reflected values they couldn't understand or respect. Things that actually matter, I repeated slowly, letting the words sink in. You mean things that matter to you? Things that would make you proud to tell your friends about your daughter, the successful veterinarian in San Francisco or New York or Boston. Things that would reflect well on your parenting and your family's status in the community. There's nothing wrong with wanting to be proud of your children, Mom defended, but her voice was getting higher, more strained. You're right, there isn't. But there's everything wrong with being unable to feel proud unless your children conform to your specific vision of success. I sat back down, suddenly feeling the weight of 30 years of trying to earn approval from people who would never give it. And that's what this is really about, isn't it? It's not about my happiness or my fulfillment or even my financial security. It's about your disappointment that I haven't become someone you can brag about to your social circle. That's an incredibly selfish interpretation, Dad said coldly, his business mask slipping to reveal genuine anger. We've sacrificed for your education, supported your dreams, and invested in your future. The least you could do is show some appreciation by making the most of what we've given you. Making the most of what you've given me according to whose definition? I demanded. I am making the most of my education. I'm using it every single day to help animals and serve my community. I'm making the most of the values you supposedly taught me about hard work and dedication, and helping others. The only thing I'm not making the most of is your specific vision of what my life should look like. Because your vision is limited and selfish, Mom snapped, all pretense of loving concern finally abandoned. You're thinking only about what makes you happy in the moment instead of building something lasting and meaningful. What I've built is lasting and meaningful, I replied firmly. It's just not lasting and meaningful in ways you're capable of recognizing. The silence that followed was different from the earlier pauses, heavier and more final. We'd reached the end of pretending, the point where polite family dynamics couldn't paper over fundamental incompatibilities in values and worldview. Well, Dad said finally, his voice carrying the finality of a business decision, I think we've heard enough. If this is really how you feel about your family, if you really think we're such terrible people for wanting better for you, then maybe it's time we stopped pretending otherwise. What does that mean? I asked, though I suspected I already knew. It means that if you're determined to throw away everything we've tried to give you, if you insist on choosing this limited life over the opportunities you could have, then you can do it without our support or approval. His words were measured and cold, delivered with the same tone he probably used to fire underperforming employees. Robert, Mom murmured, but she didn't sound surprised, just tired. No, Linda, she's made her position clear. She doesn't value what we value, doesn't respect what we've sacrificed for her, and doesn't want our guidance or input. Fine. She can have the independence she's so determined to maintain. I looked around the table at faces that had become stranger to me with each word of this conversation. Jessica looked uncomfortable but unsurprised, as if she'd been expecting this outcome. Michael was staring at his plate, probably relieved that he wasn't the family disappointment in this particular moment. Brittany looked fascinated, like she was watching an interesting social experiment unfold. You're disowning me, I said quietly, not really a question. Because I won't admit that my life choices were mistakes. Because I won't agree to change my entire existence to match your expectations. We're accepting your decision to live independently of family input and support, Dad corrected with the precision of someone who'd thought through the legal and social implications. You've made it clear that our opinions don't matter to you, that our values are meaningless to you, that our love and concern are unwelcome. We're simply acknowledging that reality. You're right about one thing, I said, standing up again and looking directly at each family member. Your opinions about my life choices don't matter to me anymore. Because I've finally realized that they're based on fundamental misunderstandings about who I am and what makes me happy. I turned to David, who'd been quietly witnessing this family implosion with the calm dignity that made me love him even more. I think we should go. He nodded and stood, his presence a solid anchor in the chaos of emotions swirling around the elegant dining room. "Thank you for dinner, Jessica," he said politely, because his parents had raised him to be gracious even in impossible situations. "Sarah, wait!" Jessica called as we moved toward the door. "Don't leave like this. We can work this out, have a rational conversation when everyone's emotions aren't so high." I paused in the doorway, looking back at my sister with something that might have been pity. "Jessica, we just had a rational conversation. This is the most honest we've been with each other in years. The problem isn't emotions, it's that we fundamentally disagree about what makes life worth living." "You're really going to walk away from your family over a disagreement about career choices?" Mom asked, her voice breaking slightly. "I'm walking away from people who think love comes with conditions," I corrected. "People who think respect has to be earned by conforming to their expectations. People who can't see value in anything that doesn't match their narrow definition of success." "Then you're even more selfish than I thought," Dad said with cold finality. "Family loyalty should mean something to you." "It does mean something to me," I replied. "It means standing by people who accept you for who you are, supporting them through difficulties, and celebrating their achievements even when they don't match your own dreams. By that definition, David is more family to me than any of you have been in years." And with that truth hanging in the air between us, I walked out of Jessica's perfect house and into the San Francisco twilight, leaving behind 3 decades of trying to earn love from people who were incapable of giving it unconditionally. David and I drove to our hotel in silence, both of us processing what had just happened and what it meant for our future. In the space of one conversation, I'd lost my entire biological family, but gained something more valuable: the absolute certainty that I'd chosen the right path, the right partner, and the right values to guide my life. The relief was overwhelming, like setting down a weight I'd been carrying so long I'd forgotten how heavy it was. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to worry about disappointing my parents or failing to meet their expectations. I was free to simply be myself, to value what I valued, to build the life that made sense to me rather than the life that would make them proud. As we packed our bags that night, preparing to return to Montana and the life we'd built together, I felt a profound sense of coming home to myself. The family that had raised me was gone, but the family I'd chosen was stronger than ever. And sometimes, that's exactly how it's supposed to be. The flight back to Montana felt like traveling between 2 different worlds. As we lifted off from San Francisco, I watched the city shrink below us, its gleaming towers and endless sprawl becoming miniature before disappearing entirely beneath, a blanket of clouds. David held my hand during takeoff, sensing that I needed the physical connection, even though we hadn't spoken much since leaving Jessica's house. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable. It was the quiet of 2 people, processing a seismic shift together. Everything had changed in the space of a few hours, and we both understood that we were returning to a life that would be fundamentally different from the one we'd left just days before. When we finally landed in Billings and began the drive, home through familiar rolling hills and endless sky, I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't experienced in years. The landscape that my family had dismissed as barren and limiting looked like freedom to me now. Wide open spaces that matched the expansiveness I felt inside after finally breaking free from expectations that had never fit. Our dogs greeted us with the enthusiasm of creatures who understand that love doesn't come with conditions. Max, our German Shepherd mix, practically knocked me over in his excitement, while Luna and Scout, our rescue border collies, danced around our feet as we unloaded the car. Even our ancient barn cat, Hemingway, deigned to acknowledge our return with a slow blink from his perch on the porch railing. Dr. Harrison had left a note updating us on the few cases that had come up during our absence. Mrs. Peterson's mare had successfully delivered twin foals, a rare and complicated birth that he'd handled with characteristic skill. The Johnson's retriever had recovered well from his surgery, and the boarding animals had all been model guests. The normalcy of these updates felt like a balm after the emotional chaos of San Francisco. That first night back, David and I sat on our porch with cups of coffee, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of pink and gold that no city could replicate. The silence was comfortable now, filled with the sounds of our animals settling in for the night and the distant lowing of cattle from the neighboring ranch. "How are you feeling?" David asked finally, his voice gentle in the gathering dusk. I considered the question seriously, taking inventory of the complex mix of emotions swirling through me. "Sad," I said honestly, "and relieved, and angry, and free. Is it possible to feel all of those things at once?" "I think it would be strange if you didn't," he replied. "You just lost your family and gained your freedom in the same moment. That's not something anyone processes easily." Did I lose my family, though? I wondered aloud. Or did I just finally acknowledge that I never really had them in the way I thought I did? It was a question that would occupy my thoughts for weeks to come. Over the following days, I found myself examining old memories with new clarity, recognizing patterns I'd been too hopeful or too naive to see before. The signs had always been there: the conditional approval, the subtle dismissals, the way my achievements were measured against different standards than my siblings' accomplishments. I thought about high school graduation, when my acceptance to veterinary school had generated polite congratulations, while Jessica's acceptance to Stanford had prompted a celebration dinner. I remembered college visits where my parents had spent more time questioning my choice of major than celebrating my academic success. Even my wedding day, when their emotional distance had been so obvious that David's family had quietly stepped in to fill the gaps in parental enthusiasm. The memories didn't hurt as much as I'd expected them to. Instead, they felt like pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place, creating a picture that made sense of years of confusion and disappointment. My family's love had always been conditional, performance-based, tied to their vision of who I should become rather than acceptance of who I actually was. Work became my sanctuary during those first weeks. There's something profoundly healing about focusing on concrete problems with clear solutions. A sick calf needs antibiotics and careful monitoring. An injured dog requires surgery and post-operative care. A horse with colic needs immediate attention and round-the-clock observation. These challenges demanded my full attention, leaving little room for dwelling on family drama. Our clients, many of whom had become genuine friends over the years, seemed to sense that something had shifted without prying into details. Mrs. Patterson, whose ancient cat Whiskers had been my patient for 3 years, brought homemade cookies along with Whiskers for his routine checkup. Tom Bradley, whose ranch we'd helped through a difficult calving season, insisted on bringing us fresh vegetables from his garden, even though his animals didn't need any medical attention. These gestures of care and community support reminded me daily of what I'd chosen and why it mattered. These people valued David and me for our skills, our dedication, and our genuine care for their animals. They didn't question our choices or suggest we'd be better off somewhere else. They simply appreciated what we brought to their lives and community. The holidays approached with a complexity I'd never experienced before. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't have to plan around family obligations or navigate the emotional minefield of family gatherings. The freedom was exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. David's family invited us to join their Thanksgiving celebration, as they had every year since our marriage. But this year, the invitation carried different weight. These people had always treated me like family, but now they were my only family, at least in the traditional sense of holiday gatherings and shared celebrations. The Thompson family Thanksgiving was everything my family's gatherings had never been. David's mother, Carol, cooked for 3 days and refused all offers of help, with genuine warmth rather than martyred self-sacrifice. His father, Bill, told the same stories he'd told for decades, but somehow they got funnier each year instead of more tiresome. David's siblings and their children filled the house with laughter and chaos that felt organic rather than orchestrated. Nobody questioned my life choices or suggested I should want different things. Nobody compared my achievements to some external standard of success. Nobody made me feel like I needed to justify my presence or prove my worth. I was simply Sarah, David's wife, part of the family, because David was part of the family and he'd chosen me. Sitting around their scarred wooden table, eating turkey that Carol had raised herself and vegetables from Bill's garden, I felt a profound sense of belonging that I'd never experienced with my biological family. This was what family was supposed to feel like: acceptance without conditions, support without strings attached, love that didn't require performance or achievement to maintain. After dinner, as we sat around the living room sharing stories and watching football, Carol pulled me aside with a gentle touch on my arm. "Sarah, honey, I don't know what happened with your family, and you don't need to tell me if you don't want to. But I want you to know that you've always been our daughter, not just David's wife. Family isn't about blood. It's about who shows up for you consistently, who celebrates your joys and supports you through sorrows." Her words brought tears to my eyes, not from sadness, but from the recognition of being truly seen and valued. This woman had never questioned my choice to become a rural veterinarian, never suggested I was wasting my potential, never made me feel like I needed to be someone different to earn her approval. Winter in Montana is stark and beautiful, a season that demands resilience and rewards it with stunning landscapes and profound quiet. During those long months following the Thanksgiving confrontation, I found peace in the rhythm of our work and the simple pleasure of building a life that aligned with my values. Emergency calls still came in the middle of the night, but instead of feeling like interruptions, they felt like affirmations of purpose. When Tom Bradley called at 2 in the morning because his prize bull was injured, David and I dressed quickly and drove through snow and darkness to help. When Mrs. Patterson's cat went into crisis during a blizzard, we made the treacherous drive to her farm without question. These moments of service, these acts of showing up when people needed us most, reinforced daily why I'd chosen this path. My family might not understand the value of being trusted with emergencies, of being the person people called when their animals were in crisis, but I understood it perfectly. This was meaningful work, important work, work that made a real difference in people's lives. Spring brought new challenges and new confirmations of our choices. A complicated horse surgery that I performed successfully was featured in the state veterinary journal, bringing recognition from colleagues across the region. A collaborative project with the Agricultural Extension Office to improve vaccination protocols for local ranchers demonstrated the impact we were having on the broader community. Most significantly, we made the decision to expand our practice by partnering with a young veterinarian fresh out of school who shared our commitment to rural practice. Dr. Emily Rodriguez brought fresh energy and new techniques, while we provided experience and established relationships. Watching her excitement about serving our community reminded me of my own early passion and reinforced the value of what we were building. That summer, I received a letter that caught me completely off guard. The return address showed my aunt, Patricia's handwriting, my mother's sister who lived across the country and had minimal contact with our immediate family. Inside was a brief note expressing her sorrow about the family rift and her hope that time might heal the wounds. More surprisingly, she included a copy of a newspaper clipping from her local paper, featuring an article about rural veterinarians that mentioned my work with emergency equine surgery. She'd seen my name and wanted me to know that not everyone in the extended family shared my parents' narrow definition of success. The gesture was small but meaningful, a reminder that family connections could exist outside the immediate circle of judgment and conditional approval. Patricia's note included her phone number and an invitation to visit if I was ever in her area. It was the first contact I'd had from anyone in my extended family since the Thanksgiving disaster, and it felt like a tiny bridge across the chasm that had opened up. I debated for weeks whether to respond, uncertain about reopening any family connections after working so hard to find peace in their absence. Eventually, I wrote a brief thank you note, acknowledging her kindness without committing to renewed family relationships. It felt like the right balance between gratitude and self-protection. The second anniversary of the Thanksgiving confrontation passed quietly, marked more by absence than active remembrance. David and I spent the day working with Dr. Rodriguez to vaccinate cattle at 3 different ranches. Exhausting but satisfying work that left us tired and fulfilled as we drove home through the autumn landscape. That evening, as we sat on our porch watching the sunset, I realized that I rarely thought about my biological family anymore. The anger had faded, replaced by a kind of neutral acceptance that some people simply couldn't understand or appreciate different ways of living. I'd stopped waiting for apologies or recognition, stopped hoping they might someday acknowledge the value of what I'd built. Instead, I'd focused on nurturing the relationships that did sustain me. David, our chosen family of friends and colleagues, the community that valued our work, the animals that trusted us with their care. These connections felt solid and authentic in ways that blood relationships never had. Dr. Harrison officially retired that winter, selling us his remaining share of the practice and moving to Arizona to spend his golden years in warmth and leisure. The transition ceremony was held at the local community center, with half the county turning out to honor his 40 years of service and to welcome David and me as the practice's new sole owners. Standing in front of that crowd of farmers, ranchers, pet owners, and fellow professionals, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment that had nothing to do with external recognition or social status. These people trusted us with their animals' lives, relied on us for expert care and compassionate service, valued us as integral members of their community. The contrast with my family's dismissal couldn't have been more stark. Here was a room full of people who understood exactly what we did and why it mattered, who appreciated our skills and dedication without needing us to be anything other than competent, caring veterinarians committed to serving their needs. 3 years after the Thanksgiving confrontation, David and I made a decision that would have scandalized my biological family. We bought a larger ranch property that would allow us to expand our rescue operations and provide space for the boarding and rehabilitation services our community increasingly needed. The property came with an old farmhouse that needed significant renovation, a large barn that could be converted into additional clinic space, and 50 acres of pasture perfect for horses recovering from surgery or illness. It was a substantial financial commitment, requiring loans and careful planning, but it represented the natural evolution of everything we'd been building. My parents would have seen it as further evidence of our limitation, choosing to expand within our small community rather than seeking opportunities in larger markets. But David and I saw it as proof of our success, evidence that we'd built something valuable enough to grow, something that met real needs in meaningful ways. The renovation process became a community effort, with clients and friends volunteering time and expertise to help transform the property. Tom Bradley and his sons helped rebuild the barn's interior. Mrs. Patterson's nephew, an electrician, rewired the entire facility. Even Dr. Rodriguez rolled up her sleeves to help paint and organize supplies. Working alongside these people, watching them invest their own time and energy in our expansion, reinforced daily the value of the relationships we'd built. This was what community looked like, what mutual support and genuine care felt like. It bore no resemblance to the competitive, status-driven dynamics that had characterized my family relationships. As the 5th anniversary of the Thanksgiving confrontation approached, I found myself thinking not about what I'd lost, but about what I'd gained. The freedom to build a life based on my own values rather than others' expectations. The peace that comes from being valued for who you actually are rather than who people think you should become. The deep satisfaction of work that makes a real difference in real people's lives. David and I had never had the children we'd once hoped for, our fertility struggles eventually leading us to embrace a different kind of legacy. Instead of biological children, we were mentoring young veterinarians, providing a model of rural practice that attracted idealistic graduates who wanted to serve underserved communities. Dr. Rodriguez had been joined by Dr. James Park, a large, animal specialist whose Korean immigrant parents understood the value of serving others even when the work wasn't glamorous. Our rescue operations had saved dozens of animals who now lived productive lives with grateful families. Our emergency services had prevented countless tragedies, saving animals whose owners considered them family members. Our community education programs had improved animal welfare across 3 counties. This was our legacy, built not from obligation or expectation, but from choice and commitment. It might not have generated the social status or financial rewards my parents valued, but it had created something more precious, a life of authentic purpose and genuine connection. The phone call came on a Tuesday afternoon in October, exactly 6 years after the Thanksgiving disaster. Jessica's name appeared on my phone screen, the first contact I'd had from any family member since Patricia's letter years earlier. I stared at the display for several rings before deciding to answer. "Hello, Jessica," I said neutrally, unsure what to expect after so much silence. "Sarah?" Her voice was different, less polished and more uncertain than I remembered. "I hope it's okay that I'm calling. I got your number from Aunt Patricia." "It's fine," I replied, though I wasn't sure it was. "What can I do for you?" A long pause followed, filled with the kind of hesitation that comes from trying to bridge years of separation with inadequate words. "Dad had a heart attack last week," she said finally. "He's recovering, but it was serious. Mom thought you should know." The news hit me with surprising neutrality. I felt concern for another human being's suffering, but not the deep emotional impact I might have expected when hearing about my father's medical crisis. The distance I'd traveled, both geographically and emotionally, had apparently insulated me from the sharp edges of family drama. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said sincerely. "Is he expected to recover fully?" "The doctors think so, but it's going to be a long process. He'll need to make significant lifestyle changes." Another pause. "Mom's been thinking about family, about how short life can be. She wondered if maybe enough time had passed for us to try talking again." I understood the subtext immediately. Facing mortality had prompted reflection about family relationships, possibly even regret about the way things had ended. But I also understood that this didn't necessarily mean any fundamental change in their attitudes or values. "Jessica, I appreciate you calling to let me know about Dad's condition. But I need to be honest with you, I'm not interested in resuming family relationships that require me to defend or justify my life choices. If Mom and Dad have genuinely come to understand and respect the life David and I have built, that's wonderful. But if they're just feeling sentimental about family connections without any real change in perspective, then reconciliation wouldn't be healthy for anyone." "I think they've changed," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "This health scare has made them think about what really matters." "Maybe it has," I agreed. "But what really matters to them might still be very different from what really matters to me. And that's okay. We don't have to want the same things or value the same achievements. But we can't have a relationship if they can't accept my choices without trying to change them." The conversation continued for a few more minutes, with Jessica providing updates on family news and me sharing brief information about our practice and community work. It was polite but careful, like talking to a distant acquaintance rather than someone I'd grown up with. After hanging up, I sat quietly for a long time, processing the unexpected contact and my own response to it. I felt no urge to rush to my father's bedside, no desperate need to reconcile before it was too late, no guilt about maintaining boundaries I'd established for my own emotional well-being. What I felt instead was a quiet confidence in the life I'd built and the choices I'd made. My father's health crisis was genuinely concerning, and I hoped he would recover fully. But his mortality didn't change the fundamental incompatibilities that had driven us apart, didn't make their conditional love any more nourishing, didn't transform their values into something I could embrace. David found me on the porch that evening, looking out at the pastures where our rescued horses grazed in the golden light of late afternoon. He sat beside me without speaking, understanding that I needed time to process whatever thoughts the day had brought. "Jessica called," I said eventually, and told him about my father's heart attack and my mother's tentative overture toward reconciliation. "How are you feeling about that?" he asked, his voice carefully neutral. "Peaceful," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of the answer. "I hope Dad recovers fully, and I'm genuinely sorry they're going through this crisis. But I don't feel guilty about maintaining distance, and I don't feel tempted to compromise my boundaries for the sake of family harmony." David nodded, understanding the significance of that emotional clarity. "You've built something here that works for you, that aligns with your values and makes you happy. That's not something to apologize for or abandon." As the years continued to pass, I occasionally received updates about my biological family through Aunt Patricia or mutual acquaintances. Dad did recover from his heart attack, though he retired early and scaled back his business activities. Mom became more involved in charitable work, perhaps finding meaning in service that she'd previously dismissed when I'd chosen it. Jessica's career continued its upward trajectory, bringing the recognition and financial rewards that validated my parents' definition of success. Michael eventually settled into steady employment and a stable relationship, maturing in ways that probably surprised everyone. I felt genuine happiness for their achievements and personal growth, the way you might feel pleased to hear good news about former neighbors or old college friends. Their successes didn't diminish my own satisfaction with my choices, just as my happiness didn't require their approval or understanding. The veterinary practice continued to flourish, expanding services and building relationships that enriched our entire community. David and I marked our 10th wedding anniversary by taking our first real vacation in years, traveling to Scotland to study rural veterinary practices, and returning with new ideas and renewed appreciation for the work we did at home. Our rescue operations had evolved into a formal nonprofit organization, supported by volunteers and donors who understood the value of giving animals second chances at good lives. The education programs we'd developed were being replicated in other rural communities, extending our impact far beyond our immediate service area. On quiet evenings, sitting on our porch and watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in impossible colors, I sometimes thought about the parallel life I might have lived if I'd bent to my family's expectations. The prestigious city practice, the financial success, the social status that might have made my parents proud. But I felt no regret about the path not taken. The life I'd built with David, rooted in service and community and authentic connection, had brought me a deep satisfaction that no amount of external recognition could have provided. We'd created something meaningful together, something that made a real difference in the lives of animals and people who depended on us. The family that had disowned me for failing to meet their expectations had inadvertently given me the greatest gift possible: the freedom to discover what success looked like when defined by my own values rather than their limitations. In trying to punish me for my choices, they'd liberated me to fully embrace them. Sometimes the most loving thing people can do is admit they're incompatible, that their visions of life are too different to bridge, that forcing connection causes more pain than accepting separation. My biological family and I had finally achieved honest communication at that Thanksgiving dinner, even if honesty had ended our relationship. The family I'd chosen, the community I'd joined, the work I'd committed to these connections were based on mutual respect and shared values rather than obligation and expectation. They had sustained me through challenges and celebrated my achievements in ways that felt authentic and nourishing. As I sat watching the stars emerge in the vast Montana sky, surrounded by the animals we'd rescued and the life we'd built together, I felt profound gratitude for the courage to choose authenticity over approval, meaning over status, connection over convention. My family had said I was dead to them, and in response, I'd made it official. But what they'd intended as punishment had become liberation. What they'd meant as ending had become beginning. Sometimes being declared dead to one family is exactly what you need to discover the family that brings you fully to life. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.